continuing our series on politics and religion, and specifically talking this morning about power and politics, and be unpacking that. And one of the things I've been following this week, I imagine some of you have as well, is the situation in Libya. It just struck me as we're in the middle of this sermon series on religion and politics, and on Tuesday, September 11th, we had another clash of religion and politics that didn't end well at all. And this is where we begin to recognize and see again the darkness that can happen when religion and politics get mixed up together in the wrong kind of a way. I've been following the story. I don't claim to understand it all. More information keeps coming out every day. I do know that one of the things that happened was that there was a protest going on at the Libyan embassy, and my understanding now is that terrorists came and took advantage of that situation and then brought violence into that situation and brought harm, and that's what killed one of our ambassadors and 3 others at our embassy. And it's a reminder that there is religion and politics at work in the Middle East. What else was interesting about it was to later find out that this was connected to a film made here in the United States about the prophet Muhammad, and that it was being promoted by a pastor in a church in Florida. And it was a really bad, I saw clips of it online. It's just bad quality, bad history, bad theology. And so it's bad in a lot of ways, but to use this as a tool to provoke others, and then the provocation. So what I'm saying is that it was terrible what happened to our ambassador, and the violence there's no excuse for it. There's no excuse to take, for me, there's no excuse to take violence up against a cause to try and create harm for someone else. And at the same time, I'm also seeing the dangers of when religious leaders try and provoke other religious leaders and things like that. So we see this mix today. It's a reminder of us of just when religion and politics can go bad. As I was reflecting on it, as I've been thinking about power and politics, I went back to a book written by Richard Foster. And Richard Foster wrote a book called The Challenge of the Disciplined Life on the issues of money, sex, and power. And he had this to say about power. He said, when we are convinced that what we are doing is identical with the kingdom of God, anyone who opposes us must be wrong. And when we are convinced that we always use our power to good ends, we believe we can never do wrong. But when this mentality possesses us, we are taking the power of God and using it to our own ends. And that's a great example of when we get it wrong when it comes to power. When it's really about our agenda and not God's agenda, but we use God to promote our agenda or our need for power or control. And there's a very big danger in that. Now, I don't know if you also followed the story enough to know that the Libyan people had, I thought, a great response to what happened at the embassy. Did you all see? I got a picture this morning. We have a picture this morning of this is a Libyan young man. There was multiple pictures of this, and his sign says, as he's holding up the sign, says, "Sorry, people of America, this is not the behavior of our Islam and prophet." And what I appreciate about this is that they said, we're not going to let these other people speak for us, and they apologize for something they don't do. So what I see them doing is they're attempting to be peacemakers rather than problem creators. They're attempting to bring peace rather than to continue the violence and the problems that are going on in this situation. Now, it's interesting because Jesus, when he was on the planet, he didn't really get that involved in politics. He didn't seek political office. He didn't take on any political agendas. He wasn't in all, some people thought he was here for that, but he wasn't. He didn't say a whole lot. There's not a whole lot that Jesus says that applies to politics. He has a lot to say about power. He has a lot to say about how we confront power, how we deal with power, how we wield power. And I think about that, and I think Jesus has some lessons for us as well today as we look at politics today and how does power get wielded today. The other thing we heard the kids read this morning was they read out of Colossians. What Colossians says is that Jesus, through Christ, through God, through Christ, that all powers were created. All authorities and thrones and governments were set up ultimately through God and through Christ. So ultimately, the supreme power of the universe, the supreme power and of all powers, is God's power. And God's power at work through Christ. And so here we have Jesus, the one through whom all powers and thrones and governments were in a sense set up or allowed to be created, standing before another man who's in power. His name was Pilate. We heard that in the gospel. And he actually ends up being the person that has the most power at this moment in Christ's life. And Christ is standing before him, and you can see the confrontation of power. What strikes me is actually in this whole episode between not only Pilate and Jesus, but we also have to keep in mind that the high priest, or Caiaphas, another guy named Caiaphas, was involved. So we've got three what I call power players in this event. So here are the three power players: Caiaphas, Pilate, and Jesus. They all have power. Now, Caiaphas has power as the high priest. But interestingly enough, Caiaphas, if you remember, he brought Jesus to trial brought him to religious trial in the middle of the night. Now, why in the middle of the night? I mean, why couldn't we just wait till the next day, you know? But he actually is manipulating the trial system, and he's actually skipping important steps in what was set up in the religious trial system to make sure that Christ gets to Pilate. And so he is using his power to manipulate the system and get Jesus before Pilate, because they understood that they could not crucify, as religious leaders, hey, we're not going to kill Christ, you know. We can't have that on our hands. So we're going to get somebody else to do it for us. So Caiaphas and the high priests work to manipulate the system. They use their power to manipulate. Then you've got Pilate. Pilate is actually the governor here, and he has the power to crucify and to sentence Jesus to crucifixion. And so he's there, and interestingly enough, Jesus comes to him, and what's his conclusion on the whole issue is, I don't see anything again. You guys don't have a case. You don't have any. What's the charge? I don't understand what you guys are. What's going on? He actually wants to acquit Jesus at this point. He's saying, I find no charges against him. He can't figure it out. So in a way to kind of appease the people, he actually at this point, according to the Gospel of John, has Jesus beaten. Then they put the purple robe on and the crown of thorns. And he thought that maybe by publicly displaying Christ and saying, hey, look, I've punished him and we've humiliated him, will that appease you? Is that enough so that we don't have to crucify him? So Pilate's trying to appease the people's wishes. And still, what do? They say, no, I don't want to. That's not enough. He was hoping, I think he was hoping that they would be appeased and that they would decide not to crucify him. It's interesting because who do they appeal to? The religious community, who claims to act for God, appeals to whose authority? Not God's authority, but all of a sudden they're appealing to the authority of the emperor. They claim the authority of the emperor. They don't claim God's authority. They claim the emperor. So again, this manipulation, they're trying to manipulate Pilate into doing what they want Pilate to do. So we've got Caiaphas manipulating power. We've got Pilate trying to appease the people with his power. Ultimately, he does make the decision based on his appeasement, his desire to appease the people to crucify Christ. But then we have Jesus. Jesus doesn't use his power to manipulate. Jesus doesn't use his power to appease. In fact, when Pilate says to him, I have the power to let you go, to acquit you, Jesus says to him, you really think so? You only have power because it's been given to you. So I want you to think about this for a minute. I hope you can get your mind around this like I hope I can explain is what I'm saying. You've got Pilate who has the power in this situation. And you've got the creator of Pilate, the power of God in Christ, face to face. And I don't know, if I was in that situation and I had the power, I would have taken over. I would have seized control. I would have created a defense. I would have gotten out of there as fast. I would have said, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you need to let me off. And here are the reasons why. You shouldn't crucify me. But Jesus allows himself to be crucified. Jesus divests himself of power. He lets go of power. That's what's so counterintuitive to us, isn't it? Because we are people, human beings, who want to have control, have power, seize control, get our way, be right, have our agenda win. And here we have Jesus letting go of power, letting go of control, divesting himself of power. The one who was the most powerful is letting go of power. The one who had the power lets it go. That's what amazes me about Jesus. That's what amazes me about this situation, is that here is this person letting go of power, and it seems so foreign to us to do that. Interesting that all the time that Jesus was with his disciples, he also taught them this. You know, Jesus had another, if you read through the Gospels, you'll see several times where Jesus is teaching his disciples to let go of power. For example, James and John in the Gospel of Matthew, James and John wanted to sit at Christ's left and right on the throne. There's a story about Jesus said, you know, they thought Jesus was going to be a political power guy. They thought he was going to be on a throne of power, and so they wanted to be in the two other power positions next to Jesus. And so they said, Mom, you know, you don't go ask Jesus directly. You send Mom to do it because Mom's got a softer hand, you know. So Mom, go ask Jesus to see if we could sit at the left and the right. And so Mom goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, can my sons, James and John, can one of them sit at your left and one of them sit at your right when you come into your throne, when you come into your rule, when you're in power? And Jesus, first of all, says, you don't know what you're asking because I'm about to take up a cross. And he says also, and then he goes on and he says this. He says in Matthew chapter 20, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. What Jesus is saying is that servant leadership, using power to serve others, using a power not to grab position, but to use power to serve other people, to be a servant leader is what Jesus is talking about. He's calling his followers to be servant leaders. I think as we look at the political process in our country, we need to discern that. I think we need to look at that. We need to look at our politicians and our leaders and ask the question, are these folks, as they're in political leaders, are they serving others? Are they servant leaders in their positions? Politics can be a servant of the people. I mean, the good of politics is it was set up to serve the people, to serve society, to make laws and things that would serve us. A great example of that is the seatbelt law. You remember the seatbelt law? Came about in the 1970s. We're all supposed to wear our seatbelts, right? Now, most people think that's a good law. Now, except for my grandfather who drove down the middle of the road, didn't want to wear a seatbelt. He would complain that they made that law. But in general, that was a good law to put into place. Politicians acted not to think about what would be good for the people, what will save lives. And so they were being servant leaders in creating that law. So from 1975 to 2006, they've estimated that over 226,000 lives have been saved because of seatbelt laws, that people have not perished in automobile accidents because of that law. And so this is an example of where the law and politics can serve the people and do good for people and good for our society. And so we want to look for that kind of leadership, servant leadership, from our political leaders, I would hope. The other thing that Jesus does as he's working with his disciples is he also talks about another characteristic of power and divestment of power. Not only about being a servant leader, but he also calls his disciples and his followers to be humble, to show humility. You know, anytime they would, again, the disciples are like you. I identify with the disciples more than I identify with Jesus sometimes. I don't know about you. But they're coming to Jesus and saying, you know, I want to be first. And that's when Jesus says to them, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And then oftentimes, Jesus then would illustrate this, and he would bring a child into their midst. And he would welcome children into his presence. And there's, you know, in the 21st century, we revere our children. I mean, our children are top priority in the 21st century. In the first century, children were not the top priority. They were not revered. They were kind of low on the totem pole. It was a patriarchal system. And so children, you know, kind of like pushed off to the side. And so when Jesus was bringing them in and saying, I want you to have the faith of a child. I want you to have the humility of to be humble like the child to his disciples. He's actually calling his followers to humility. He does this a couple different times. He brings a child in their midst and has them stand with them and talks about their faith or talks about the need for humility. So we need leaders with humility. You know, yesterday, the reason I'm moving a little slow, maybe a little low energy day for me, is I ran a triathlon yesterday. I did the Savage Man triathlon at Deep Creek Lake yesterday, and I survived. They give you yeah, I don't need the applause. I'm not bringing this up because I need to be applauded. They gave me a shirt. You give you a shirt that says you finished the Savage Man triathlon. I think it should say I survived the triathlon. Mine should say that. But during the day, as I was out on the course running or on a bike, I was going through the course, and these people would pass me. And, like, not just one or two. I mean, they're multiple. And I won't get into the whole story of that. But so they're passing me, although I did pass one guy. And he was 68. But I thought, I really, it didn't do anything for my ego at that moment at all. But as I was up alongside of him, I just said to him, I said, I hope I'm still doing this when I'm 68. I hope that I'm still able to do this one. I thought it was great that he was out there. He needs applause, not me. So I was doing that. But what happens, see, in a triathlon, they do this wonderful thing, and they take a black magic marker, and they put your age on the back of your calf. And so everybody knows how old you are. So here's the thing. I didn't mind if somebody 29 passed me. That wasn't an issue. I'm fine. Yeah, you should be passing me. And you should be doing it faster. What always got me was the 52-year-old, the 55-year-old that would be passing me up these hills. And men and women are totally different about this, too. The men would just go right by me, not say anything. The women would come by me, oh, it's a great day, isn't it, as they're going by me. And I'm like, great day for you. So, or they'd say, you know, they're so encouraging, you know, they would say, you're doing a great job. And I'm like, well, if I'm doing such a great job, why are you flying by me right now? Anyway, so all I'm saying is that I had a lot of humbling moments yesterday. And, but there's a difference between being humbled and having humility. We all are humbled at times. We all have those moments when we're humbled. That does not mean that we have humility. That there is a characteristic of leadership that humility is needed. Jim Collins, in his book Good to Great, about the business world and about business leadership, who's studied corporations and companies and Fortune 500 companies, he talks about the 5 levels of leadership. And level 5 leadership is like the top leader. They're the best leaders that we have in the business world. They're level 5 leaders. You want to take a guess at what one of the 2 characteristics of the top best leaders are? Humility. That the best leaders are the leaders who have humility and are working for the good of the organization, or working for the good of the company, or working for the good of the institution, and not just there to promote themselves. Those are the leaders that are the great leaders. And I think those are the kind of leaders our nation needs in politics. We need leaders with humility. I think Abraham Lincoln was actually an example of that. I mean, Lincoln was known as one of the presidential leaders of our nation that had humility. He's also known as the president that pardoned the most people in his presidency. Of any other president, I believe he still is the president that has pardoned the most people. Most of those were brought up on charges, were soldiers who had been brought up on charges of cowardice in the face of the enemy. And these would come across his desk, and it was punishable by firing squad. That was the punishment for cowardice in the face of the enemy in the Civil War. And so anytime he had an opportunity, he would pardon those soldiers, and he would send them back to the battlefield to give them a second chance. He thought it was actually not only in the best interest of the soldier, but he believed it was in the best interest of the nation to give people a second chance. He was looking out to the interests of others, not just using his power to do what he would like to do, whereas others would have had them killed. And so he chose to do that. He exhibited humility. So servant leadership and humility is what Jesus taught his followers. I also think these are important attributes and characteristics for political leaders. I don't know if you agree or don't agree. It's okay. Send me an email later this week. But I think servant leadership and humility are two key characteristics we should be looking for within our leaders and within the leaders of our nation and within politics. The tough part is that we know that sometimes in politics you may not get it right. What I'm saying is actually something I've been reading out of a book about Jim Wallace. Jim Wallace wrote a book called God Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. He talks about a lot of people that he saw go into politics, and he said these are good people. People that go into politics are good people. They want to change things. They want to do good for society. They want to serve the people. So they go in with that intention. They go into politics wanting to make a difference. And then somehow along the way, things change. This is what he says in his book. He says, many came to Washington because they truly wanted to do the right thing. But after a while, they get entrenched in Washington's ways, and change seems ever more distant. Power and wealth are the real governors here, and people adjust to those realities. Hear that word again, power, wealth. That something about being in that system kind of sucks you in to that. And we see that even being, I read recently a Time magazine article comparing how much money was being spent on campaign ads and who was spending more money and less money, and how wealth is kind of a part of this now political process. And power, this position of power, the presidency, is a power position. So how does a political leader prevent themselves from acquiescing to that system, to getting sucked into the power and wealth dynamics of the political system? How do you do that? Well, I don't have any perfect answers to that. But I think there is something that leaders can do to help keep themselves grounded, to help keep themselves from being a part of that system. And actually, I'm going back to Abraham Lincoln again. The reason you wonder why I'm quoting Lincoln, because I actually read this book several years ago. I picked it up again this week. It's called Lincoln on Leadership, Executive Strategies for Tough Times. I think we're in tough times. Lincoln was, when he was the president during the Civil War, one of the things that Lincoln did that not all presidents do, but something that was very important for him, that I think flowed out of his servant leadership, flowed out of his humility, was he didn't spend all his time in the Oval Office. He actually left the Oval Office a lot of the time and went out to where the people where things were happening. For example, one of the things, he spent lots of his time in the telegraph office at the White House because he was waiting. He wanted to be the first one to hear what was happening on the battlefield during the war. So he would spend a lot of time in the telegraph office. The people in the telegraph office got to know him pretty well. He got to know them well. Some suggest he may even gotten to be more friends with the telegraph office civil servants than some of the other political leaders in the nation, because he spent a lot of time there. The other thing he did was he actually went out. He left the office. He would leave Washington. He would go and meet with his generals at the battlefield in the headquarters as the battles were going on. He would be there and he would spend time there learning what was happening, learning from the officers, talking to the generals. He actually got involved in some of the decisions, the strategic decisions in the battlefield. So he got out of the office and he got out there. He also would meet with cabinet members and generals in their own homes. He didn't call them to his office. He went to their place of home and he would talk to them at their dinner table or at their kitchen table or their dining room table. And this is what's been known in the world as, I don't know if you've ever heard of this phrase, management by wandering around. MWBA, MBWA, sorry. Management by wandering around. That's what Lincoln did. And I think what he was doing was he was keeping himself grounded as a leader. He was keeping in mind what were the real problems going on in this time of his life. Instead of just kind of holding up in the office, and, doing whatever he was going to do. He actually got out in the field. And isn't that what Jesus did? I mean, Jesus left his throne of power in heaven, and he came to earth. And he walked among us. He was management by wandering around, understanding what it was like to be human, understanding the needs of the people. Isn't that what Jesus did? So he gave up power to be with us. And it wasn't enough that he just gave up power from heaven, but he not only divested himself of that power, but he divested himself of even earthly power and control, and he allowed himself to be crucified on a cross. He gave up all power so that something more powerful could happen. And it's the power of the cross and resurrection that changed the whole world. I am so glad that Jesus didn't take a political office. I'm so glad that Jesus didn't just become king of Israel, because all that power would have been just kept right there. But because he was willing to let go of power, he transformed the world. Because he was willing to let go of his power, God's power was able to change the lives of millions and go beyond just that one location. And there ends the lesson for us, isn't it? That when we're willing to let go of power, great things can happen for God. Amen.